Um, I'm going to be talking about some similar things to Megan with work that I've been doing in Bangladesh with a group there for about 10 years. Um, and it's this thorny question of how do we revamp. Now, when I say a strange situation, I don't mean the strange situation. I mean any strange situation that social scientists would put someone in to try to find out about the world. And the premise is that the many tools that social and behavioral scientists use to gather information about our fellow humans have generally been honed on a very rarefied set of humanity with a specific set of cultivated skills, the ability to read and write, extensive experience engaging with abstracted details of situations, hypothetical scenarios, and the willingness to suspend disbelief to do that. And that's just a few of the types of skills and motivations that we're talking about. This allows us to because of this coevolution, this codependency between participants and protocols, this allows us generally, when working with the right participants, to collect data in a quite efficient manner that generates reliable results. But the problem is when you try to take this to other places where it hasn't been refined in such a way, things can break down. And this is a different talk than I normally give because it's based largely on my own observations and field work and field notes, having tried to develop protocols. This was not the original goal of the study that we were doing. It's kind of a side effect of it. So for that reason, I'm not going to be presenting many charts or graphs about the kind of stuff we're doing, but simply the process by which we went through revamping a specific common protocol that's used in the social and behavioral sciences today. So I'm returning to the map I showed this morning, and we see in the last 10 years calls for increasing diversity, meaning that we go to different field sites around the world. As researchers do this, they oftentimes bring the tools that have been crafted already through generations of refinements. These are some examples of the kinds of tools someone might put in their toolbox and take with them to a new site. So paper and pencil tasks, hypothetical dilemmas where you ask whether you're going to throw someone over a bridge to save 5 people. When I went to Bangladesh and tried to convince people to do it in this way, they were just like, what are you talking about? This idea that going from left to right can indicate magnitude differences in Likert scales. And then the idea that we can use a circle to be perceived as a person and the overlap between those two circles as a representation of the relationship between them. These are just some examples of the kinds of tools that have come out and I would say have evolved after many rounds of selection on a specific set of human beings. So I like to think of this as a population. Whenever we come up with protocols, they're really researcher-constructed social situations involving symbols, language, rituals, intended to elicit responses that will teach us something about how people think and act. And then in most cases, that goes through a sieve or many sieves. Does it efficiently generate useful data from undergraduates? And then we get specific tools. And I'm not pulling out these tools specifically for ridicule other than the fact I've tried to use them before, and they've had to be adapted. I think that many of the tools that we might take with us would have similar issues. So this process of selection on cultural variance isn't necessarily a problem if everyone had the same set of skills and competencies, motivations, expectations about how we should be interacting with individuals. But in many cases, these tools have evolved through multiple iterations with folks who have the ability to read and write, to quickly process large numbers and abstract figures, willingness to entertain hypothetical vignettes and abstracted details about situations without asking more about the context, and obedience and willingness to suspend disbelief about the researcher's requests. So when we do try to take these protocols that have been selected on a specific set of participants to new places, there are many issues that can arise. One of the most commonly dealt with issues, there's a vast literature on this, is how do you deal with language differences, dialect differences, wording differences. So a naive thought experiment is if someone went into another culture with another language and tried to do an interview in a language other than the people spoke, right? That would obviously break down. And there are different ways of dealing with linguistic translation, dialectical issues, and wording. But there's also, underneath this, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's unusual symbolic associations, assuming what details will be salient to a specific individual in a specific context. implicit models of reasonable responses. This is why I was reading Blaylock's work earlier, because he talks about auxiliary measurement theories, our assumptions, our tacit assumptions about what is reasonable responding when we have a protocol. Norms of appropriate interaction, and sometimes asking the wrong questions. One example of this with norms of appropriate interaction, Charles Briggs has an excellent book called Learning to Ask, where he talked about taking an interview protocol, kind of the standard approach to the interviewer is the dominant person who controls the situation and learns from the person being interviewed, to a situation in northern New Mexico, a wood carving community in Cordoba, New Mexico. And he learned very quickly if all he had relied on was this interview technique, he would have only been able to talk to one or two people who, from traditional anthropological perspective, they were the excellent informants. Those were the people who were willing to engage in this kind of interview format, were willing to be the subordinate person, even though they were actually teaching the ethnographer, and also were willing to translate their tacit knowledge about wood carving into explicit language. What he found was when he started to do more observation and other forms of learning in the community, he learned a great deal more about wood carving than he could have if he had focused on the one or two informants who were able to engage with his original protocol. Another example of unusual symbolic, there's lots of unusual symbolic associations that we assume people come to the table with when they use our protocols. This is just an example from a paper in 2003 in ergonomics where some researchers were interested in how people perceive street signs in different countries around the world. And they looked at misperceptions and perceptions in, let's say, Finland, Canada, other European countries. And what you find is something as crucial as a street sign, I mean, these are important for our health and survival, can be very heavily misinterpreted. So for example, who thinks they know what this means? Right here. Who would want to venture a guess? Burning car approaching, okay, that's one guess. That might have been my guess too. This is a place that cars carrying explosives cannot go, okay? That is the interpretation. So sometimes we think that images, more than words, might be a natural way of communicating across different groups, but even something as important as traffic signs, we can't necessarily get off the bat. So some of the consequences of poorly adapted tools are, first of all, as in the Briggs case, selecting informants who are willing and able to engage with the protocol and discarding those or ignoring those who don't respond as we expect. Concluding group differences are due to deficiencies in the concept of study, for example, IQ, rather than subtle differences in the meaning of language, symbols, and rituals of the situation. And also assuming that negative or agnostic responses mean ignorance or disinterest in a given domain, as opposed to, I'm not happy with the way you're asking me, you're not following the norms of conversation, or I'm actually interested in this domain, but I think about things in a different way. So for example, I would never try to guess how many kids I want over the course of my life, but I'm happy to talk about how I want a birth space. And this is what Jennifer Johnson-Hanks has worked on. So these are just a few examples of the consequences of poorly adapted tools. So adapting protocols to a new context, many of us have had to do this in different ways, are crucial for collecting data that's meaningful and comparable. It can also, I think it's more than just methodological, it can reveal errors in our implicit theories of how people should perceive and respond to different stimuli. And that's where it gets kind of theoretically interesting. Most participants in this colloquium, as I said before, have had to do this in their own research. But except for work on wording and linguistic translation, the process is generally quite opaque. It was very hard to find a literature on this, and usually it relies on tacit and traditional knowledge within the research community. So in the interest of transparency and a way to talk about this, I'm focusing on one specific case study, work I've been doing on this notion of social discounting. This is different than the social discounting concept in economics, and the definition of it in psychology is that you're willing to give up or sacrifice more money for someone you feel closer to than someone you feel more distance from. There are many, this already starts involving metaphorical thinking about closeness as something you can assign to a relationship, and we'll explore that in more detail. So this is one graph showing what 60 or so studies have already shown in the United States, but also among college students in China, MTurk users in India, is that the y-axis is how much an individual is willing to forego, and then the x-axis is how distant this person is from you. So for example, number 1 is the person who is closest to you in your life. Number 2 is the next. So if you had to order all the people in your life, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, to 100 is someone you kind of maybe know, maybe you don't know their name, but you see them at work, maybe a stranger. And then you see a very steep gradient in terms of how much people are willing to give. This is true in both hypothetical situations and situations where real money is at stake. What you find here is that the original study in Stony Brook in 2006 showed this kind of gradient. When we do it with ASU students, we almost get the exact same gradient. M-Turkers from India and the United States are more similar to each other than they are to the college students. But you get the same slope, right? So this is a very common recurring finding. People have tried to find the neurobiological roots of it. They have also tried to identify whether it's a hyperbolic curve or an exponential curve, and I'll show you that in a second. But before I talk about translating this protocol, I wanted to tell you what the standard protocol is. So this is from the original 2006 study. Imagine a list of 100 people closest to you in the world, ranging from your dearest friend or relative at position 1 to a mere acquaintance at 100. The position at number 1 would be someone you know well and is your closest friend or relative. The person at 100 might be someone you recognize and encounter, but perhaps you may not even know their name. That's the x-axis. The y-axis is money foregone. So this has been adapted from temporal discounting studies that use a similar kind of choice format. You will make a series of judgments based on your preferences. On each line, you will be asked if you would prefer to receive an amount of money for yourself. So let's say $155 for yourself, or have it split, $75 for the other person and $75 for yourself. And then you're asked to make a series of decisions. Normally, when you do this with undergraduates, either in China or the United States, what you find is people have very consistent responding, which means that they go down the list, they say, well, I'm not willing to give up $80 for this person to get $75, and maybe not $70, and maybe not $60, but you know what, I might be willing to give up $30. And then at that point, they switch and they change all of their responses so that now they're willing to give. So they're not willing to give, and then at some point they are willing to give. And that's called a crossover point. What you do normally is there's maybe 5% of people who aren't consistent, and you just throw those cases out, right? I say that with a grin because I'll talk a little bit later about why that can be a problem. So then you get a nice curve like this. It was similar to one I showed before, but now it's rather than on a log curve, it's just 0 to 100 on a linear curve. There's been some debates about whether this is a hyperbolic relationship or an exponential relationship. I'll show you in a second that these are very fine points that when you try to translate this to other cultures, we just have to start asking much more coarse-grained questions as to whether it's exponential or hyperbolic. So there have been a few attempts to translate this to other places. One was done by Boyer and Leonard in Zoo in 2012 among Turkana pastoralists. Well, what we found was, what happened with them was they really didn't translate the protocol sufficiently to be able to say, if you don't find discounting, that you don't find discounting according to the original protocol. The reason was they didn't ask about closeness. They used named relationships in a society, so whether people are age mates or whether people are friends, as proxies for closeness, and that raises all kinds of issues in terms of how comparable it is. And then there's also been work in India, not about closeness per se, but about liking and how much you feel emotionally close to someone or how much you like them should be affecting your willingness to sacrifice for them. So to assess differences and assess hypotheses about this variation, we need to develop protocols that are both locally meaningful and comparable across sites. So I do work in northwestern Bangladesh, in this area right here, kind of on the border with India, close to Nepal and Bhutan. Bangladesh is an extremely densely packed population, about 170 million people living in an area the size of Louisiana. So wherever you walk, you see people. Even in rural areas, it's about 90% Muslim, 10% Hindu. Most people are Bangla speakers. It's rapidly urbanizing and modernizing. but we've worked mostly in rural areas where people still engage in rice and jute agriculture. We work primarily with 4 villages, 2 Hindu, 2 Muslim, to examine maybe differences in religious differences between populations, but also high and low wealth populations to see what effect material security has on their decisions. This is one example of a village surrounded by beautiful patchwork of rice and jute fields, and each of these dots is one house. This is a view from within the village, a dirt road between mud houses where they're drying dung for fuel. This is a Hindu temple. And then this is the view looking out from the village where you see folks working to process rice that has been collected from the fields. I would be remiss not to talk about the team that I work with. Most of the individuals sitting around right here are members of the research team, which works with other projects as well. This is part of a hospital and development organization in northwestern Bangladesh that has over time built capacity with locals who now are experts on interviewing, on survey construction, on using MS Access. And it's quite a sophisticated operation now. This right here is Sweetie, one of the team leaders, telling me that this protocol is crazy, that we need to fix it. She's like, so she's like, keep track of this. This is something we need to make sure we fix next time around. And then how do we pilot and identify problems in communication? So we're very lucky that that the people we work with are comfortable enough with us that they will tell us if they don't understand. They're not going to say they'll do this. So that we hear we don't understand a lot at the beginning of piloting. But we can also ask, does this make sense? What are you asking? What are we asking you to do? So they tell it back to us to see if they really understood what we were trying to say. Bujna is just the spontaneous, I don't understand what you're talking about. Long hesitations, laughing out loud occasionally at the protocol and just sitting there. Repeated questioning about what am I supposed to do again. Once again, I don't have quantitative data on this, but it's quite remarkable the first time we pilot something, how frequently this happens. And then later, after maybe 5 piloting rounds, you get almost none of it. You still get some, but not nearly as much. So many obvious revisions that we had to go through, which most people who adapt protocols had to do. Paper and pencil tasks were unworkable. We had a hands-on protocol with concrete and visually intuitive artifacts. So making the decision became having 2 tickets this is 2 bags of rice. And if I had asked you what this was, who would have said this was a bag of rice? Okay, a few folks, right? But in this community, it was very easy. This made sense as a bag of rice. So 2 bags of rice for yourself or 5 bags of rice for a stranger. And they would hold the tickets and they'd put one in a lottery basket and they'd throw the other one away. So it was very clear what was happening with the decisions. And then we gave them a number of decisions and then recorded them after the fact. We had to use real versus hypothetical payoffs. And that had to be rice and not money because we had used money in the communities before and it was causing enough problem with envy that it was going to ruin our relationship with the communities. And we decided that's not important enough. We're just going to work with rice. Portable screens for anonymity. This is actually an example of trying to use portable screens in an earlier study I worked on with Joe. We went to the local wedding coordinator and they have all these great tapestries and we would put them around to make sure that when someone came into the area that no one else could see what they were doing for the full study. And we used photos to identify people because in these communities, oftentimes maybe 5 or 10 people would have the same exact name, formal name. They might have nicknames, but it was very difficult to identify people other than through photos. So the 2 things I'm going to focus on specifically are how do you translate that x-axis and y-axis. So the first thing is, what does closeness mean? Closeness is a spatial metaphor that we use in the United States to describe a quality of a relationship. If we had developed this idea in Mongolia, it might have been insideness, because the way you talk about a friend is a dotni naids, which means an inside friend. In the Netherlands, we might have been thickness, where you talk about dikke vrienden. So in the United States, we use closeness, but it's not clear that is a spatial metaphor we should always be using. So people also talked about near friends, kache bondhu, prio first, so they used an ordinal metaphor, but this was the one when we did open-ended interviews that people always talked about, both in terms of their friends and their kin. So we used that. And when we did interviews, it really fits quite closely with our own, or with the conceptions you would have in the United States about what does a close relationship entail. We had to measure it then, and two tools we tried to work with. One was based on the inclusion of other in self scale, where there are 7 items, and each item represents overlapping circles at different levels of overlap. This would be the most close, this would be the least close. And then the social distance manipulation, which is you ask someone to imagine a list of 100 people and then selectively choose person 1, person 2, person 5, person 10. So for the Aaron et al. Scale, inclusion of other in self scale, we tried many, many things. And Joe was forced to work with us on this in the Virtues and Conflicts study about 6 years ago, where instead of the circles, we tried stick figures, which are also abstracted characterizations of people. There were issues with this form because maybe it was hierarchical as opposed to closeness, so someone was on top versus someone was on the bottom. We tried it laterally. We tried bins where you put photos in it. So on the left side is the closest, on the right side is the closest, is the farthest. None of this worked, and finally, after some thought, we just switched it from being left to right to being from the person, the ego, to far away. And so the person here is putting photos in cups. This is the closest bin, this is the farthest bin, and all of a sudden it became very fluent for most people. Not everyone, but for most people. And what we found is that they could take 100 photos and easily put them in bins within 5 minutes. And it was reliable in the sense that if you did it one time and then you did it 7 days later, you got very similar results. I'm still surprised that it was so simple and it took us so long to get at that. It took us like 2 weeks of constant piloting to get at this. But it does seem to work now. So the second issue was ranking closeness to others, which would be a more direct replication of the Aaron et al. Study. So the standard is imagine a list of 100 people in your life that you feel closest to, and then select some people at different distances. We found that that wouldn't work. People just were like, what do you mean by person number 5? What do you mean by person number 10? But what we ultimately did was we had the photos of everyone in the community. We just asked them to please choose the 20 photos of others you feel closest to, and then explicitly rank all of them from 1 to 20. We didn't go all the way beyond that because that would have been too onerous, but that was enough for our purposes. And then the researcher just picked out 1, 2, 5, and 10. So they didn't have to hypothetically choose person 5 out of some list that was in their head. We've actually made it very explicit on the ground. So the question is always, when you're translating cross-culturally, is it successful? You never know for sure, but we now had little hesitation, and we also had fluid responses. We had very few examples of people saying, what are you talking about now? There was very good cross-measure reliability between the rankings and the average bin location in people's responses, and also reliability over time. There were expected associations with genetic kin and spouses, so that folks felt very close to their spouses and their genetic kin, which was surprising to the team, who, although had grown up in the area, had come from a more urbane setting and had also gone to college. Most of them had gone to college. They were expecting that the folks would not feel very close to their spouses because some stereotype they had about arranged marriages. It turns out that people felt very close to their spouses. They were always putting their spouses in number 1. And then finally, when we compared this to an external benchmark of, did the other person that you talked about, did they say that you helped them in the last year? Then you saw 4 times greater helping among those who were in bin 1 versus bin 5. So, but based on a number of checks, we felt like we were getting what we were supposed to. But more importantly, I think this revealed some pretty important tacit assumptions about what we came to the field with. So this idea that moving from left to right on a Likert scale is a straightforward way to represent magnitude or distance, that it's straightforward to perceive 2 overlapping circles as oneself and another person, with the degree of overlap reflecting the quality of the relationships. Participants can readily imagine a list of 50 or more people. That's an assumption on some quality. And this is also why ethnography is really important, because in this case, mixing metaphors of spatial distance in the task with thickness in the linguistic description of the task, gunishta, did not appear to pose serious problems for respondents. So I thought that was going to be a problem. But then when we did it, it didn't seem to pose many problems at all. So I have a few more minutes, so I want to go into the second part, which is that y-axis. And this is a very standard protocol, not just for collecting data on social discounting, but temporal discounting, risk discounting, where you give people a series of choices, in this case, maybe a half kg rice for you versus 5 kg for Anise, and a consistent responder would say, okay, I'll give this to the other, I'll give this to the other, but nah, at this point, I think I'm going to keep this because this is enough. I don't want to sacrifice that much. An inconsistent responder would say, well, I'll keep half kg for myself, but then maybe I'll give 1 to you, 2 to you, but then I'll keep 3 for myself, 4 for myself, and 5 for myself. The standard practice in all of these forms of discounting is to throw out inconsistent responses based on a model that respondents should treat each decision as independent and apply the same utility function to each independent decision, which isn't much of a problem because in most cases it's about 10% of folks who get kicked out. The idea is that they haven't been following the rules, they don't understand the task. The issue is that in Bangladesh and now in Indonesia, where one of my grad students, Leo Tiokin, has taken the same task, we see very high rates of inconsistent responding. Now the question, when we start getting these high rates that don't fit our tacit models of responding, we have to start asking, is it a problem with the participants? Is it a problem with the task? Or a problem with our tacit model about how participants should respond? Some evidence for 3 in Bangladesh is people, when they were doing piloting, would talk out loud about their decisions. It was kind of a common thing. It was like, well, you know, I might do this. And very frequently, you'd hear things like, well, I didn't give up 1 kg in the last decision, so I'll give up 2 kg this time. So they were not treating these as independent decisions. They were treating it as an aggregate decision. And so for that reason, we might be making bad assumptions when we assume that they have to be responding in what is considered a consistent way. We also found the same associations of amount foregone with other variables, like relative need closeness among both the consistent and the inconsistent responders. So obviously they were responding in a way which was as reasonable relative to the other variables as the folks who were responding in a consistent way. So one tacit assumption potentially revealed through this process was respondents should treat each decision as independent and apply the same utility function to each independent decision. So summing up, the vast majority of tools that social and behavioral scientists use to learn from their fellow humans have been honed on a rarefied set of humans possessing unique skills, motivations, and expected modes of social interaction. Through this process of methodological honing and refinement, we found tools that efficiently generate reliable and novel data on the same set of participants, but the success of these tools may depend dramatically and crucially on those unique skills, motivations, and expected modes of interaction. The process of adapting protocols is a crucial yet often hidden part of this research in cross-cultural studies. I think one of the great insights that can come from this is it can reveal implicit theories of how respondents should perceive and respond to protocols. And when our idea, not when they, the participants, but when they, our theories, our tacit theories are wrong. And it deserves systematic study to probe these implicit theories and develop better protocols. It may also make theoretical contributions by revealing subtle differences in perception and cognition, and possibly, although we didn't find that in this case really, and perhaps this is the wrong way to go about it, identify practice competencies and learned motivations that individuals possess in diverse settings that we do not find in great numbers among US college students. It would be nice if that would be one way of finding those things. Ethnographic piloting, I think, is crucial here because cumulative cultural learning, often over generations, is effective at constructing lifeways, practices, knowledge, and ways of perceiving the world that are unique and sometimes we can't predict a priori. So because of this, successful protocol adaptation will likely benefit from careful on-the-ground observation and long-term conversations with folks in the places we work. I'll leave this as the last slide, transparency and systematic study of the protocol adaptation process. Is it worth it? And when I say transparent, it means doing it better than I did it. It means actually going in and doing more systematic studies of how manipulating these things change people's responses. I think in one way it's good because it allows us to learn from others about how to make protocols better. And when I was showing my grad students about this, they were like, man, like I've been to the field already. I wish I had seen something like this because I just kind of winged it, right, when I went into the field. So that's one positive outcome of this kind of transparency. Learning about errors in our tacit assumptions we make about how people should respond. But The downside is it adds even more cost and difficulty to those of us who are working in cross-cultural settings and taking a lot of effort and time to cultivate relationships and get the research done that we've been asked to do. So this might be an added burden, which could actually have a perverse consequence of making people do less of this kind of work. With that, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and also thanks to the collaborators both in the lab and also at Lamb Hospital in Bangladesh. So thank you.